Hello everyone, my name is Patrick Riker, and today I'm going to show you all my PowerPoint I made for content analysis assignment number 3. And in this, I'm going to be talking about 10 important events that are going to be laws and court cases that have impacted the education of English language learners. All right, so the first one I'm going to be talking about here is Brown v. Board of Education. And it's a landmark case in 1954 and outlawed segregation in schools on the basis that it would provide unequal education for African Americans. And the court case established that segregated schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And for a while, it was only targeted and only enforced by desegregation of schools in regards to making sure that white Americans and African Americans are able to get an equal education. And then after a while, though, parents of English learners were able to argue in court that their children also applied to this too, especially Mexican Americans, where English may not be their first language or they may not know English at all. And before this, schools would really have non-existent or no bilingual programs whatsoever, or even scaffoldings to try and teach these kids the English language. So without these kids knowing the English language, it's almost like a sink or swim approach, where you would just throw these kids into the classroom and hope they can somehow grasp the material without even communicating or knowing the language that the instruction's being taught at. So this was being applied to there, and they were arguing that whenever the teachers in schools were doing this, it wasn't providing it wasn't giving equal treatment to their children or given their children an equal opportunity to learn than other students who have English as their first language. Okay. The next one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what this did is it ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And for a while, when it first came out, it was mainly addressing and was mainly being enforced by having white Americans and African Americans integrate into schools and making sure they have equal learning opportunities and equal treatments among the races. And for a while, it was enforced just like that. But then after a while, around May 25th, 1970, the Office for Civil Rights determined that schools that were not properly addressing English language learners were in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And what Title VI is making sure that public entities and public organizations, say like obviously a public school, they have to be equal opportunity to be able to. They have to have equal opportunities and equal chances to be able to teach all kids, no matter the race or no matter national origin. And Mexican American parents were arguing that by excluding their kids or by trying to teach the contents of the class without either teaching it in their own native language or without giving them proper supports to be able to learn the English language, it was determined that they're not really getting equal treatment under Title VI, and thus public schools have an obligation to guarantee all students an equal opportunity to succeed. So schools were failing to do that if they're not addressing the needs of English language learners and taking steps to teach these students the English language. So this determined that that was a violation of their rights, and you would have to, you couldn't do a sink or swim approach in regards to that. Okay, the next one is the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, and this was actually an amendment to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So when they were amending it, I think when it was being reauthorized, and it was the first federal. Okay, my bad. It was the first federal U.S. law that was specifically addressed to assist students with limited English skills, so they were able to actually appropriate the right funds, be able to have the stipulations to it, and everything like that. So it wasn't just like before, where it was piggybacking off of, say, the Civil Rights Amendments or the Brown v. Board. This was actually specifically targeted towards being able to, specifically addressing the needs of English language learners specifically, and authorize resources to support educational programs, teach teachers and aides, develop and disseminate instructional materials, and it encouraged parental involvement. And it was kind of left in the air of whether this act was meant to speed the transition to English or to promote bilingualism. It wasn't really addressed here exactly, but it just gave the funds out to those schools and had them determine on their own. All right, and next is the Serna. All right, and next is the Serna v. Portales Municipal Schools. It's a 1972 lawsuit brought by Mexican-American parents in New Mexico, and it led to the first court mandate for bilingual education, because before this, it was just the legislative side with the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, and other court cases, but those court cases were just for addressing the Civil Rights Act and civil rights. This is specifically targeting and specifically mentioning the needs of English language learners. And the judge ordered instruction, that instruction had to be in the children's native language, and culture has to be part of the plan to be able to desegregate them and eventually move them into, make them proficient enough in English to be able to grasp and able to complete the content of the academic content. And the court case determined that under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Hispanic students have a right to bilingual education. All right, and next is Lau v. Nichols, and this was a 1974 Supreme Court case that alleged that Lau's child was failing in school because he could not understand the language of instruction. And this was the only such ruling on the rights of language minority students by the Supreme Court. Lau's argued that his kid was being denied education of equal terms outlined in Brown v. Board of Education case because of his kid's limited English skills. And the courts determined that it also violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, because it's not truly equal if you give every single kid the same instruction and the same materials and the same activities if one of the kids does not speak the English language. So the Supreme Court determined, it upheld what other court cases have said, and that without supplying adequate supports for ELLs, you're in violation of Title VI. Okay, and next is the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. And this was passed and made the court decision of Lau v. Nichols into official federal law, because before this, it was just the court that decided it, the Supreme Court, but this codified it into the legislative part of the government to ensure that ELLs have adequate supports and equal education. And Congress passed this as a bill amending the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And it's important in that it contained a very clear-cut definition of what it means to be denied equal education opportunities. And that means, it requires schools to take appropriate actions to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in its instructional programs. Okay. Next is Rios versus Reed, and that's a 1977 case that ruled that Patchogue, Medford, New York, violated the rights of English language learners by providing a bilingual education program that was not sufficient. They just almost did it as just a check mark, just to make sure it's down, but it wasn't actually helping the students whatsoever to learn, to be able to integrate and learn English. And the court determined that a judge determined that the district's goal of teaching Hispanic students the English language was met, but the district was not doing an adequate job of teaching academic content before and while proficiency in English was being met by the English ESL students. So what this means is that while they were teaching them English, in the meantime, they weren't giving them the adequate supports and the adequate aid to be able to do the academic contents with it. So they were still getting these failing grades and not doing well in school because of the fact that they weren't able to speak English, not because of the fact that they weren't able to perform the academics. All right, next is Castaneda v. Picard, and that's a 1978 court case. Castaneda claimed that his two children were being segregated and that the school failed to supply adequate bilingual education programs. And over time, the Laus versus Nichols ruling has been diminished by subsequent rulings, and it became harder to argue that discriminatory efforts stemming from programs is in violation of Title VI of the CRA without intent being proved. Now, this court case relied on the Equal Education Opportunities Act instead of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to argue that lack of supports for ELLs were violating the rights of these students, thus determining that there does not need to be an intent to discriminate to determine if a school is violating the civil rights of these students. All right, next is U.S. versus Texas, and this was a 1982 court case that was rebuked and reversed the previous year's court case, and that was being presided by Judge William Wayne Justice. And Judge Justice found that the state of Texas segregated students to quote-unquote inferior Mexican schools, that's what he said, and had disparaged the language, culture, and heritage of these students. And in conclusion, Judge Justice mandated bilingual education in grades K through 12 across Texas. Now, a year later, in an appellate court, they reversed this ruling on factual grounds. They said that it was determined that there was insufficient evidence of discriminatory practices to vindicate or to mandate that bilingual education must be a requirement for K through 12. Okay. Next is Proposition 227, and this was a 1998 ballot measure in California, and this mandated that ELLs be taught in English only in special education classrooms. And then when proficient enough in English to meaningfully understand the contents, they would be moved back into the general education classroom. And people who are, officials who supported this proposition, they supported it because they thought this was the fastest and easiest way to get students proficient in English enough to be able to understand the contents or academic contents that the schools would be teaching. And the only problem, and then people who didn't support this thought that the disregard for the students' first language and not building up the vocabulary in their language and making them bilingual, because this proposition is more about them losing their first language and going and acclimating themselves entirely to the English language. And that's what the opponents of this did not like. However, though, San Francisco and San Jose were exempt from this because of previous court rulings in 1974 and 1985, one of them being Laus v. Nichols. And here are my references. Thank you so much, and have a good day.